Well, welcome everybody. Very nice to see these familiar faces. Let me, for purposes of efficiency, give very brief introductions to our three distinguished speakers today, and then we'll engage in a 45-minute informal conversation, after which there'll be a chance for all of you to jump in with your questions. So going in alphabetical order, we have Mark Galeotti, tuning in from Washington, D.C., who's honorary professor at University College London in the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. We have Michael Kofman, director of the Russian Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis, tuning in also from Washington, D.C. or nearish. And then we have from France, Marlene Laruelle, director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So we're delighted that we have three terrific speakers today to take on, the very large question of what power is and what constitutes power. And we'll start with a question to Mr. Galeotti. And the question is rather to the point about how helpful it is to understand power in Russia or power in the Kremlin as that of a mafia clan. And what limits obtain, if you accept that premise that this is how sort of the frame for Russian power, what limits obtain within that situation?
Yeah, I'm always uncomfortable with that particular analogy. It ties in with a whole Russia as a mafia state. Firstly, because obviously it's tremendously heavily weighted. And secondly, because it has kind of specific implications about the relationship of the state to organized crime, who runs what and so forth. But I think the main thing is, look, actually mafia clans and fairly primordial states have very, very similar patterns. I mean, I think it's more that we must acknowledge that this is a regime which essentially has become a pretty personalistic secular monarchy in all but name. There isn't a divine right, there isn't a clear line of succession, but in terms of the day-to-day exercise of power, it is essentially about personal relationships overlaid over institutional ones. I mean, my own kind of favored way of thinking about power within the system is that it is an adhocracy, in that it is not that institutions don't matter. It is actually, though, that the real significance is how are you useful to the boss today? And it may well be that people end up then being assigned roles which actually have very little to do with what their business cards or the plate on their office door says, but actually relates to what they need. And this is kind of something that we're very, very familiar with from history. In relatively sort of pre-modern states, actually, it was quite usual that just the monarch decides that this particular aristocrat will be the ambassador to go on a trip to hopefully secure a trade deal with some distant land, or will be the general who leads the armies forward. It is not actually that there was a sort of an expectation that individuals would always have the same role. And I think that's what we see in Russia today. So yes, it is a bit like a mafia clan, but so many other things as well. And it's more about the personalistic relationships of power and the deinstitutionalized way in which this system has moved.
Your comments, Mark, remind me of a quip that the great historian Peter Brown made, the historian of late antiquity, when he watched The Sopranos, the TV show about the mafia, said it reminded him a lot of the Merovingians in 7th, 8th century France. So it's another way of working with this kind of analogy. Turning now to Mr. Kofman, the question is, concepts like honor and power are to a certain extent in the eye of the beholder. How much is Russian power projection weakened? Do you think the Russian military leaders are aware of this? And if so, are they responding? The assumption being that hiccups and difficulties in the war have led outside observers to lower their assessment of how much Russian military power there truly is.
Okay, well, that's an easy one, Mike. Let me see. So here's kind of my view of it. The mythos definitely of Russian military power and prior perceptions of it to some extent is gone, but that's going to be reassessed over the course of the war, because you always have the initial takes based on the first couple of weeks of the conflict, and then you have a series of narratives that start to compete for each other based on how the war evolves. But if you look at power from the standpoint of perception, right? Perceptions, international perceptions really matter. One of the things that people believed really secured Russia's position in international politics and Russia's status were perceptions of Russian military power, right? And that was really dented. Now, there's complexity to measuring power because you have power's potential, but when it comes to military matters, military power can never be measured in the abstract. It always needs a context to express itself, right? So in different contexts, military power leads to completely different outcomes. That's one thing. On the other hand, the specific outcome in any context in any war is not necessarily a good determination of a country's military power either. But once you see military power express itself, people begin to form views, right? They begin to reassess on what they thought, because before they kind of had a sense of, let's say, Russian military potential in a big conventional war. And now they've seen it, and now they think, oh, we've overestimated the Russian military, right? And now they ask, okay, if Russia doesn't have a good argument for its status and position in international politics based on economic influence, economic dynamism, let's say ideas or its model of political or economic development, right? Then the other basis for its positional status, which is perhaps military power, right, now has to be reassessed and reevaluated. And that conversation is going to go on. I'm basically trying to both take the analytical approach and saying that I'm actually very skeptical that objectively what we've seen in Ukraine should lead us to like a dramatic reassessment of Russian military power. But that's because if you're a military analyst, you understand what, you know, how better to assess military power in of itself, but how other leaders will perceive what they see to be Russian military power and the extent to which it can underpin Russian arguments for the position in international system they want and for the kind of status they want. And when you tie military power to status, it becomes important, because your first comment was about honor, right? So status is both something that leaders seek as an end in of itself, because countries are run by people and people seek recognition. Countries are not run by robots, but also they seek it instrumentally because they use status as an argument in international politics for why they should get stuff and certain things, right? So they seek status both as an end in itself and as an instrument. And it's very important. It's part of the reason why countries fight over status, part of the reason why countries make argument for their status, whether they're a great power or whether they are a system determining power or not. Okay, I can keep rambling, but I hope that's like an early foray to an answer to your question, okay, the relevance of this war to perceptions of Russia and Russian status.
Great, that's terrific. Marlene, the next question is for you. How is the political system in Russia changing? Can we describe it as a more traditional dictatorship, more reliant on fear than propaganda, or do we still have elements of regime hybridity, which reminds me a little bit of Mark's term autocracy, which does imply a certain amount of hybridity?
Absolutely. I like Mark's terminology. I think it's still working for Russia. I think indeed it's a more repressive regime, a more personalistic one. It's a more autarkic, right? Kind of disconnected or sovereign in the Russian political language. But we still have hybridity, it's just on a reduced scale. We still have diversity of elites, and I think we have been able to identify. And here also, it's kind of it's what Mark was saying about who is really important doesn't necessarily fit the kind of the administrative titles of people. But if you look at the formal side, I think we still have diversity. We have now a clearly identified kind of party of war, really people who are pushing, and that means they have their own personal interest in appearing as very strong hawkish position. So of course Patrushev and the Siloviki, of course kind of Rogozin or Kadyrov, who have always been doing this kind of very kind of voicing loudly. But Medvedev is an interesting case of someone that was seen by the West as a liberal or modernizer, who is now having a very, very tough pro-war narrative. Then we have probably a kind of center or centrist, and that's where Putin is. I know it's always difficult when I say that in the West to say that Putin is still centrist inside his own political system, but there are really people who are more radical than him. And then you have the kind of the so-called systemic liberals, right? Those who are managing the financial system, the kind of economic aspect, and probably the oligarchs who are still they are not in opposition, but they have to deal with their kind of narrow scope of work and manage the war context. I think what has been interesting, and both Mark and Michael have been in fact following that probably more than me, is how much we have been seeing kind of military voices emerging that are critical of the inefficiency of the regime. And that, I think, is an interesting element where you see a critiques of the regime coming from people who are not criticizing the regime for its ideological aspect, like the liberal. They are criticizing the regime for not fulfilling the ideology is saying, right? So people who say, okay, you told us full conquest of Ukraine, let's do that. To do that, we need mobilization, we need to declare the war, and so on. So I think what we see emerging, and that's really interesting, it's a kind of segment of with some kind of leading key public kind of opinion leader on Telegram channel. You have all this military channel with military expert talking with very critical of the regime, but at the same time, they are very legitimate because they are ultra patriotic, right? So I think there have been interesting kind of readjustment of the regimes. It still has some hybridity, but the hybridity has been reduced and the shift is going toward the most kind of radical segment. And of course, the so-called liberal one is kind of getting totally crushed.
Wonderful. So adhocracy, reduced hybridity, and the status-seeking impulses of the Russian regime. I think that's the best I can do in terms of paraphrase of this phase of the conversation. Let me now turn to a few other questions and issues, starting again with Mark. This sort of feels to me like this is the question very much on the lips of many people in Washington, D.C. And this is, what are the chances that the system frame, given its reliance on policing and paramilitary units, Rosguardia units are unhappy with the number of losses. Some are refusing to fight. Is there a rumbling of instability beneath the veneer of support for the war and support for Putin?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one, especially because I can't help but feel, as with a lot of the discussion of all the sort of is Putin ill, it's very heavily laden with a degree of wish fulfillment on the part of the West. You know, we are becoming more and more aware that this is likely to be a long slog with particularly high costs, especially on the European side of the Atlantic. And as a result, there is a desperate desire for a deus ex machina, something that basically allows us not to have to think long term. And instead, suddenly, magically, Putin dies, there's a coup, and things get better. So we have to be quite cautious about that. I mean, look, absolutely, this regime is increasingly under pressure. And although in the short term, the appearance is, and this is something obviously there's an area of debate within scholars, the appearance is that the elite becomes more coherent. I think we shouldn't assume that a short-term pragmatic response to the situation actually betokens real support. I mean, this is a regime in which I would suggest there are no Putinists. It doesn't really have a strong and coherent ideology. It doesn't have anything bigger than itself that brings it together. I mean, essentially, this is a regime full of exceedingly pragmatic, opportunistic kleptocrats who absolutely are full-throatedly in support of the president and wholeheartedly, obedient to the rules, so long as it's in their interests to do so, but have no particular, in my opinion, sort of strong sentimental or other reasons to hold on to it. So at present, yes, because the regime is getting much more intolerant of any sort of signs of dissent or disagreement, because for many, particularly within the economic sector, actually, it will be government funds that keep them afloat and maintain their economic power, shall we say, and therefore they need to make nice. The days when you could think of just basically that you can make your money abroad are gone. So for all these reasons, people have pragmatic reasons to stay with the regime. But in the long term, there's no way of getting around the degree of serious, crucial economic scarring that the economic warfare, because let's be honest, what we call sanctions is actually economic warfare, is delivering and will continue to deliver and will get worse. That at present, Russia has been weathering the storm, but in part that's by burning through reserves, not so much national reserves as family and enterprise level reserves. You know, people are having to pay higher prices, but they are raiding their savings to do so. I mean, those savings are going to be running out this autumn. Likewise, a lot of enterprises are basically running through their cash reserves, but also running through the raw materials or the components or the spare parts that they acquired before the sanctions regime kicked in. That will come to an end at some point. And you know, some import substitution is possible. Some shifting to a sort of low-tech version, like we see the new cars being built without GPS, without anti-lock brakes, and so forth, and being labeled special edition. Special being 1970s edition. But you know, not everything can be sort of bodged around that way. So, I mean, you know, there is clearly what I would suggest is a lack of reserve. I mean, you know, we know that there is an issue with military personnel, but I think there's also a lack of reserve in terms of the economy and lack of reserve in terms of legitimacy. Because this is an increasingly obvious police state, the disincentives to do anything, whether you're just an ordinary Russian citizen who's unhappy or whether you are a rich and powerful technocrat, you know, are very great. For most people, the cost-benefit analysis will probably be better just keep your head down and hope things work out. But I think the thing is, what this means is actually when stuff happens, as inevitably there does, you know, when the unexpected, the black swan, or even just simply the gray swan event happens, that people are then forced to make choices, that's when I think we may see potential crises. I mean, if, for example, there is substantial unemployment, I mean, the Russian government is clearly doing what it can to particularly protect the monogorods, the cities which are, you know, very, very heavily dependent on a single factory enterprise or industry. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing these moves for the car industry for places like Galeotti. But, you know, they can't necessarily do it everywhere. If you get, for example, very high levels of local unemployment, which might lead to public protests. We have a National Guard where clearly there is a serious morale issue because they feel they've been thrown into a war for which they were neither prepared nor equipped, rightly so, but regarding themselves as cannon fodder. You know, if you look at National Guard social media channels, they're very, very angry places. So it's possible, for example, that discipline might break down. They might be unwilling to club their cousins, brothers, and neighbors for a dispute that they think is legitimate. You know, all of these things could happen. So I think it's more that I wouldn't say that we're sort of heading in some kind of inexorable line towards some kind of, you know, massive outbreak that might make the elite decide that Putin is too dangerous for them. But the point is, I think it creates a situation of potential instability that it can continue and will continue for a long time until one of these unexpected stressors hit it. And then it might well be in serious trouble because it's not got the whatever it needs to actually deal with it. So it's a very, very agnostic answer, I'm afraid. But I think the thing is that what we see is just like in some ways late Tsarism, that, you know, I would suggest that late Tsarism's capacity to reinvent itself and reform itself died with Stolypin. But nonetheless, had there not been the hammer blow of the First World War, quite possibly Tsarism would have survived, you know, quite some time longer, like some dinosaur with a teeny little brain on the end of a long neck that basically is dead a long time before the brain suddenly realizes it and then it falls over. Well, likewise, we might actually, in hindsight, find that Putinism sort of dies at some point, but it takes, you know, quite a while before a suitable shock comes that reveals that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's hard to speculate on the longevity of this particular dinosaur, but I think you do a very helpful job sketching the sort of shape and structure of the dinosaur itself. I want to go now to Marlene and to Michael in turn with a question that kind of follows from some of the terrain that Mark was just sketching. And Mark was focusing a little bit more on the elite and a Putinist system without Putinists who ardently believe in it, nevertheless keep it running for as long as it suits their interest. I want to turn first to you, Marlene, and ask about public opinion, because I know that you've been doing, you know, sort of research projects related to this, just ask you a very open-ended question. I mean, there's sort of two dimensions to the problem. I mean, there's the strains and stresses of wartime, which could lead to discontent, certainly must be already leading to discontent. And then there's also pro-war sentiment, which, if I had to speak personally, I would say is stronger than I expected it would be on the 24th of February. At any rate, I just want to ask you a kind of open-ended question, still staying on this motif of what constitutes power in Russia, of where you see public opinion fitting in at the present moment.
Yeah, I think it's always important to remember about public opinion, and we tend to too often think, well, if it's a repressive, authoritarian regime, then they don't care about public opinion. And I think they do care a lot about public opinion, because they are not ready to deal with the kind of huge unrest and kind of massively repress. It's not China, and I don't think, I think that would be difficult for them to deal with a huge unrest without partly collapsing. So the public opinion is very important, and that's why the Kremlin is spending so much money in trying to shape the public opinion. I think we should be, so as of course, we should be cautious with the way surveys can be done and what people are answering. My impression is that, yes, so pro-war sentiment is pretty high. It seems to be slowing down, but not because people are suddenly becoming anti-war, just because people don't care anymore. In the 5th month, they are less interested, they watch less television, the shock has passed, so they have a kind of fatigue. And so at the question, are you supportive of the war? People are slightly less positive than they were at the beginning of the war. People wish the war to finish pretty soon, but they still imagine that it was a legitimate war or a legitimate special military operation, and that Russia will be victorious. Right, and that's the war. It's a war done against the West more than a war done against Ukraine, and that is very visible in the surveys, which means that the people interpretation is very much embedded in very long-seated vision of the West is trying to attack Russia through Ukraine, and Ukrainians are only kind of victim of the West. So that is a persistent feeling, and I think we should take it seriously. And I don't like the kind of, like, oh, they are just, passive brainwashed people by media propaganda, not realizing. I think it's much more complex than that. I think many people know more about the war than they want to say they know when they are asked the question. I think there is just a huge, cognitive dissonance for the majority of the Russian population to recognize that it's a war, that Russia is the aggressor, and that it's a very violent war against a broader nation. So people are in a kind of cognitive dissonance of negating what is happening, but also trying to avoid, standing out from the crowd. And I think that's one of the big tool of an authoritarian regime like the Russian one, is that it's very risky to take risks. And not so much kind of, being arrested and so on, but just not feeling at home anymore, feeling, like disconnected from your family, from your professional circle. So people tend to, try not to think about that and move back to their private life. And here we have, I think, very old kind of Soviet tradition. If politics is too difficult, then you just go back to private life and you try not to think about that too much. The part that of the population that is anti-war has been very courageous, but it's a minority. But what is really interesting is that, and that is confirmed by all the surveys, I mean, those done by Levada, but also those done by more kind of official survey agency like FOM and so on, is that it's a super generational divide. Right, the older you are, the more supportive of the war. The younger you are, the less supportive. The youngest you are, the less supportive of the war. That is very visible. You see very clearly also professional and kind of income and education level. The more you live in an urban big city, the more educated you are, the more income you are, or at least no, the more you work in the private sector, the more anti-war you are. The more you work for the public sector and you are dependent of the state, the more pro-war you are. So the sociological features are super visible, which is really interesting, I think, and that shows how it's still a very polarized society. So I think that's there. That's just some element of the discussion.
Wonderful. I mean, I think it's sort of axiomatic, you could say, from from historical studies that no war in any country gets more popular over time. That even countries that win wars have to reckon with diminishing popularity. And Vietnam War in 1963 was about 80% of the population. Of course, it was more then, but with 80% of the population in the US was behind it. 5 years later, it was a very different story. I think that's something that Ukraine and Russia both have to probably wrestle with at the present moment.
But I think if I can add on that, Michael, I think it's also important to remember that we have the same pro-war effect in every war, where usually you have the support, the trust in the government is rising at the time of war. It worked for the US, it worked where even France was in Libya and so on. So you have a moment of kind of national unity, and that Russia is not specific, right? What will be specific is, of course, the level it will be decreasing, as you were saying, and how it will be following or not the kind of the progressively losing traction and so on among the Russian population.
So my final question before we turn this to a conversation among the students with our experts is to Michael Kofman, and goes as follows. I mean, our friend Dara Messico just had a good Twitter thread on possible problems with conscription and attracting people to sort of volunteer for military service in Russia. You know, one of the black box questions I find in the war is the whole issue of Russian morale. You know, I sort of remember in the first week of the war, some prisoners of war on the Russian side being put forward on the media who sort of spoke about very low levels of morale. And there are obvious reasons why that would have been the case in the first month of the war, say. I simply don't know at the present moment, but if I could ask you, Michael, to speculate on that question. I don't think morale is as low as a lot of Western observers hoped at the beginning of the war, but I doubt that morale among Russian soldiers is super high at the moment, although in the same way that wars become with populations unpopular over time, the loss of comrades, I think usually contributes to morale sort of in the immediate sense for soldiers or on the ground. So even if they didn't understand the point of the war at the beginning, when their friend dies, they fight for the sake of their friend. At any rate, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this question at the present moment, Michael, sort of obviously bearing in mind this larger issue of power, but how morale among the military modifies, enhances, or perhaps detracts from the power of the Russian state.
Okay. Well, first, I'll just comment that in the earlier lecture today, we actually discussed this question of Russian military morale when the war came up. But I'll summarize my view on that. It was exceedingly low at the beginning because Russian troops were not told ahead of the operation what they would be doing, and they quickly found out they were sent in a false pretenses where the operation wasn't well organized, wasn't well supported. They encountered resistance they said they weren't going to encounter, and very quickly they lost trust in their commanding officers, which is very important. And they saw that the entire thing was a shambolic effort, and that led to, in a number of places, individual desertions. It led to fairly low morale among troops, and led to lower level officers refusing to follow orders and not wanting to throw their men away when they saw that the objectives of the initial campaign in the first couple of weeks were futile. I think that became obvious to a lot of Russian commanders on the ground, probably by around the second week of the war. When the war was reorganized as part of the second campaign, right, following March 25th, focusing immediately on the Donbass, but obviously just as the initial more minimalist objective, you saw morale change because you saw the Russian military retreat and attempt to reconstitute itself and try to run a war that they were much more capable of running and structuring the force in a way much was trained and organized to fight, fix logistics, fix communications, align a lot of things that they weren't using early on. Still, they had issues with morale, but you saw it begin to improve. Why? Because battlefield conditions began to improve on their end. And morale really changed in the course of a war because it changes depending on whether or not soldiers believe that they're winning, right? It changes based on the extent to which they trust their officers. It changes on the extent to which they believe that the actual war effort is well supported. You know, they're fed, they're clothed, they have the weapons and ammunition to fight. You know, early on in the war, for example, some Russian troops actually had bad equipment, particularly strangely in the areas like Kherson and in the north as well, and they caught frostbite. They weren't well equipped to it. And morale plummets very quickly when you run out of food and you're starting to catch frostbite, right? It doesn't matter what the political goals of the war are. I often try to hammer this point home because academics and policy people think that the political objectives of the war or the extent to which it is just is really important to, you know, a 20-year-old infantryman riding in the back of a BMP. And I'm going to tell you, it really isn't. That's not the primary thing that's driving their morale, these big intellectual questions. What's driving their morale is, are they being shot at? Do they have food? Do they trust their commander? Do they feel that they're going to be thrown away as cannon fodder or not? These are the questions that concern them. And the immediate situation around them, you know, because they got two eyeballs and line of sight and probably limited battlefield awareness of the big picture question. All right. I think you're quite right that some of the expectations about morale were proven incorrect, and they created what I like to call input-output problems in analysis, which is the outputs you'd expect to see from such poor morale and poor organization of, let's say, logistics did not show up on the battlefield. You did not see major routes. You did not see the Russian military, particularly in the second phase, easily giving up territory, right? You did not see dramatic loss of cohesion or command and control amongst Russian troops. Even really in the first phase, when they had to conduct retreats from both the north and the southwest, there were relatively organized retreats, right? So morale isn't good, but it also isn't that low. And it has to really change people's expectations about how easily the Russian military is likely to give up territory they've occupied, right? If they are on the defense. Last point on this. Morale is very difficult to measure. There are many terrible or bad ways to try to measure morale, which lead to pretty bad, usually essentialist or like pseudo-racist arguments about states and societies. There are very few to no good ways to measure or set up expectations for morale, that is the will to fight. I've seen many attempts at it and many good exploratory research products. You know, Ben Conable, Iran had a good one a couple of years ago, for example. But the intangibles are the most difficult to measure. That's why I call them intangibles for a reason, right? And so oftentimes people will export their bias and preferences into their assumptions about intangibles. And it's very hard to see what they are. And they change over the course of a war, right? So there's no point in the war where you can just assume that straight line, one side is always going to have more morale in the battle than the other side. Okay, I hope this part makes sense. There's more I can add to the question, but I don't want to go on for too long.
No, it's perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to bow out, and I believe Jan Lang will take over in terms of handling the questions. But I don't want to bow out before thanking our three excellent experts for their commentary so far. And now we can move to the Q&A part of the conversation.